My name is Meg Redmond. I do government relations and policy at Food Frontier. So probably first question you've got is why is someone who does government relations and policy on stage to talk about plant protein ingredients? And it's really because basically since the day I started with Food Frontier, I saw this as this great opportunity for Australia, and I have been working ever since. To see that, we've got the government leadership we need in this space to see this particular industry grow. And I should quickly say, I'll just get that's the right button. When I'm talking about plant protein ingredients, I do mean these ones. I am talking about isolates, concentrates, and textured vegetable proteins. For a quick crash course, both isolates and concentrates, they are a protein powder that's been made by extracting or fractionating out the protein content from a protein-rich crop, it be a cereal, an oilseed, or a pulse. There's a key difference, though, between them. Well, there's multiple differences, but one of the key ones, just for right now the purpose, is that a concentrate has a protein content of between 40 to 79% versus an isolate, which has typically got about 80% protein content and above. The other one we have up there is a textured vegetable protein, or a TVP. A TVP we categorise as an ingredient, but it is actually often and typically made from either a concentrate or an isolate, but it has been extruded or texturised to give a bit more of a bulkier shape, like the one that you can see pictured up here. And audience might be quite familiar with TVPs as they're often used in plant-based meats. Globally, we are seeing agricultural powerhouses similar to Australia seeking to capture the opportunity that is this industry for themselves. And that's actually where I would like to start, is an example of another country that is doing this, and that is Canada. Canada, back in about 2018, partnered with industry and government to create Protein Industries Canada, which is an innovation supercluster. And this PIC has been working ever since to capture for itself a $25 billion opportunity in global plant-based ingredients, food and bioproducts, because they did some modelling with EY, who said that globally, by 2035, this will be a $250 billion opportunity, Canadian billion, by 2035, and they want to capture 10% of it. They also, in this modelling, found that we will need between 52.1 megatons or 81.2 megatons of diverse import crops. And again, we're talking about cereals, oilseeds, pulses. It is a broad range, and I'll talk to it in a second, but we grow pretty much all of that here. And this is incredibly exciting happening in Canada because it's almost, the government is working with the entire ecosystem with some really progressive policies and is bringing the ecosystem along. And actually through PIC, they have invested to 2028 $300 million. But PIC, in the work it's doing, it is, again, it's an innovation cluster. And they are doing a lot of investing themselves, a lot of programs to build up the industry. And up until just the end of last year, they have managed to, from industry, leverage a further roughly, into the 500 millions as well. So this is really exciting. But I want to point them out as this example because, like I said, they are very comparable to Australia in terms of what they grow, we also grow. So here's a fabulous map of Australia and our different growing regions. All across us, we've got barley, canola, faba, peas, lupins, oats. We even do mung and soybeans. And like I said, comparable to Canada, they lead for lentils. We're third. Sorry, they lead globally on lentils. We're third. But we win on lupins. We're second on chickpeas. We're fourth on faba. And we're seventh on peas. And like I said, we are growing this across Australia. In total production, this is from 2021 to 2022, we did 66.5 megatons of total grain, and about 44.8 megatons of this was exported. So that is roughly 65% of our grains are being exported onto commodity markets. On the flip side, we are import dependent when it comes to ingredients. And I'm going to clarify really quickly that this data set I'm about to use is flawed. It is so flawed, so it is just one thing I would put out there, because this particular import-export code that we're using as the reference point is, it's protein concentrates in general, so we don't actually know from this, and this is one of the issues that we have in Australia, is we can't quite capture what actually is Australia's use or the exports of them, because this is about both plant and animal proteins, but we also don't know if this is for human use or for animal use as well. But it is safe to say that probably a good chunk of this, and into other export corridors as well, is going to be capturing imported soy, and a lot of it actually for animal feed. So just quickly on the stats there. We exported only about 40 million worth, whereas we imported about 120 million. This is back in 2023. So, but what we're importing, this is, I would like to point out, is really our first opportunity for Australia to displace these imports with Australian-made ingredients. But it's also how can Australian-made ingredients meet the global demand that we're seeing out there. And one last stat from me, which is that globally, obviously I've already talked about PIC, who see 250 billion opportunity globally, and they're talking about the ingredients, the food, the bioproducts market. But the ingredients itself, some estimates have it that it's going to, sorry, I said that in a different order, but there's meant to be a 14.1 CAGR expected growth for that industry. In 2023, it was already accounting for 18.5 billion globally in market worth. And it is expected by 2032 to be worth 69.2 billion. This is a great opportunity for Australia. We grow these crops, but how can we, instead of just exporting raw, be processing them onshore? Luckily, we've already got a few companies that are doing that. We've got one of them up on stage, and I will be passing them in just a second to get their expertise. But this is really an untapped opportunity for Australia at the moment, and we need a lot more buy-in from governments and across the ecosystem to see this come together. So with that, I'm done, but now it's time for my panel to chime in and give all of their insights. So I'm going to ask them to all introduce themselves, starting over here with Arjan Jongkees from Simplot.
So nice to be here. Arjan from Simplot. So we are a family-owned global company who are responsible for a number of brands in Australia, including Birdseye, Edgell, John West, and Legos, and the infamous Chico roll. My role within the company is in the science and technology space, so supporting our innovation delivery across all of our categories. With applied sciences and really building those future capabilities that we need to deliver against where we want to go as a business.
My name's Cassandra Walker. I'm based in Horsham. I work for the Victorian Government. Agriculture Victoria Research is who I work for within DECA. I'm a research leader of a team of about 13 people, and the team is known as the Crop Quality Team. So we support breeding research and agronomic research in the composition of grains, essentially for food and human consumption.
Hi, I'm Andrew May, co-CEO of Essantis. Some of you might know us from our former name Unigrain. We're a plant-based food and beverage ingredient manufacturer. The history of the business is predominantly in the manufacture of oat cereal products, but more recently we've been making a series of investments in the plant-based manufacturing space. We've built Australia's first dry pulse protein fractionation plant and also built large-scale oat milk supply chain, all in Victoria.
Thank you very much, guys. If you haven't clocked it, we've got these fabulous speakers up here because they come from across the entire supply chain, and so they're going to be able to give to you much better than I can the perspective from each of theirs about what are the opportunities and what do we need to be doing to really tap into it all. So, Cass, I'm going to start with you. Obviously, in the work that you do through Agriculture Victoria and across Australia, we have deep expertise and capability across wheat and other cereals and oilseeds in crop optimization through to onshore processing and obviously the onshore product manufacturing. How can we recreate this opportunity in Australian pulses?
The previous session kind of alluded to it. It's essentially industry partnering with research, and I think what's happened in, for example, wheat, the millers and bakers really drove the wheat industry to improve wheat quality through investing and influencing the breeding. And so they, back in the 50s, they basically couldn't make a loaf of bread from Australian wheat. And so what happened is the industry said, we can't use this product. And so they then really forced the government breeding programs to change their strategy and change the genetics that they were using in their breeding. And so they improved the gluten quality. And it's the same thing here, really, that we work with the breeding, and essentially the pulse industry was created in Australia as a commodity base, right? So it's all about size, shape, colour in terms of how the pulses are sold into these countries in like the subcontinent. And so what we now are trying to do is look at the protein composition and the protein quality and how functional it is. And so that will then help us then with indication from industry and input from industry, what their needs are and how we can match what it is we have here in Australia that will match their needs, essentially.
Andrew, next question to you, because obviously you are in this space. You're already working on Australian plant proteins from pulses. And as you mentioned, I mean, you've been in this for 40 years for a diverse number of different plant-based ingredients for food and beverage. And you've opened now a year ago your fractionation facility, but you're specifically doing pea and faba and concentrates. What convinced you to establish this capability, and why pea and faba specifically?
So I mean, a lot of the trends have already been covered, the macro trends this morning. And I think obviously everyone in this room is here because clearly everyone understands, bought into the broader thematic in terms of the demand for protein going forward. So I don't think I need to rehash that discussion for this room. The second, which you've sort of introed in the discussion, is just the complete lack of processing infrastructure historically in the Australian market. So the customers, our customer base, have been really clear over the last couple of years that there's just this growing frustration of a lack of capability in Australia. We have a really strong farming culture and agronomic capability. We've got great breeding. We have great food companies that are wanting to innovate in this space, but just a complete lack of, or up until 5 or 6 years ago, a complete lack of any protein production in this space. So we really just saw the need for food companies to be able to wean themselves off Northern Hemisphere ingredients. As far as pea and faba, we've really just got to play to our strengths in Australia in terms of pulse crops. So Australia grows 500,000 tonnes of faba beans, 250,000 tonnes a year of field peas. They're very easy crops to grow, very well known by farmers, very well understood by the food industry. So very low-hanging fruit in terms of ingredients to produce for the market.
Right, okay, thank you. And Arjan, I'll passing over to you because with Simplot, obviously plant-based is a core pillar of your offering. You've got your Edgel canned range, but you do also have a Bird's Eye range, which is doing the plant-based meats. And they're made using both soy and wheat protein ingredients. But in conversations we've had, I also know that it is core to Simplot to be able to source locally, and that you also investigated Simplot's own ability to actually manufacture these ingredients domestically. From your perspective, having gone through, with these as at the root, but also the journey you've been on, what do you see as Australia's ingredient opportunity? And is it in soy, or is it in other ingredients?
I think it's a great question, and we've spent a lot of time in Simplot is an agri-food company, a very diversified agri-food company. And we've always found our strength in working with farmers closely and understanding what that whole value chain looks like, right from seed to plate, in that whole crop space. So looking at all of our options, what we saw was the need for what internally I think I've started calling a backbone protein here in Australia. So for those, quick lesson for those who aren't in the plant-based meat space as much, but basically what you're using is one of the textured vegetable proteins that Megan was discussing at the start, and binding that together to make a finished product, a patty or a chicken fillet or the like. And those products are predominantly made, those textured vegetable proteins are currently made with 3 main ingredients. It's soy, it's wheat, and it's yellow pea. And all of them have got their disadvantages. Soy is obviously an allergen, and there's not a real nascent soy industry here in Australia of any sort of real scale. So the opportunity to make that locally and really work locally with that's not there. Wheat and wheat gluten is obviously a real opportunity, but within the plant-based space, we see we have relatively knowledgeable, engaged consumers, and if we see the number of people avoiding gluten within their diets, it comes with some real serious drawbacks, especially in the food service space, where we see people having to put allergens and allergen management plans in place, really, meaning they're not as keen to adopt those products into their ranges. And finally, currently we have yellow pea as an option, which is actually really expensive and has a number of flavour disadvantages. So I think that the real opportunity here is kind of to where Andrew is going with what are those Australian crops? How do we get that base protein we can use to form the core of our product range here in Australia moving forward to get that locally grown, locally made product offering?
Thank you. And that actually leads into the next question I've got for Cass really well, because again, in wanting to be able to use Australian, we're talking about a real diversification opportunity, which is when we don't grow enough soy and we haven't necessarily done the investment in the processing to date where other countries have already well overtaken us and have decades of experience and knowledge there. I know that there is a lot of, there is goodwill about the opportunity for soy in Australia, but it would take a lot for Australia to be able to compete really well into that space. So it's in the diversification piece. But in the diversification piece is also the issue to be managed and worked through, in that we don't really know how to use a lot of these new ingredients that are coming. We know how to use soy, we know how to use wheat, we're learning better how to use pea, but if we're wanting to use more Australian faba or other ingredients, the issue is what will they function like, what will they look like? But actually even before that is really about the crops themselves. How are we growing them? What functional capabilities do they have? What nutritional capabilities and all of that, which obviously, Cass, I'll pass to you because you are doing some phenomenal work on this right now. And it's a partnership with Grains Research and Development Corporation, so the GRDC. You're doing a project on their behalf. I'd love for you to tell us more about it and what are some of the major outputs that will come with it, and what will the sector be able to do with that information.
So it's a national project. Excuse me, I had no croaky voice before I came up here, and now all of a sudden,
help
my
yourself with
voice
some water.
is croaking for some reason. So essentially, it's a national project. Essentially, we grow grain over 22 million hectares across Australia, right? So it's a big growing field, okay, that we have here. And what the project is, it's capitalising on pulse proteins. The project essentially is benchmarking Australian grown pulses. So what we're doing is the 6 high value pulses that we grow here in Australia, we are benchmarking them against each other from an Australian grown source, as well as against what is grown globally. So we're looking at chickpea, field pea, lupin, faba bean, lentil, and mung bean. So they're the 6 pulses that we're focusing on, and we are growing them in agronomic trials. So they're replicated trials across Australia, focusing on the production regions, so that the major production regions for each pulse type. So, for example, we grow wheat across the whole country, but we can't grow all of our pulses across the whole country because there are limitations agronomically. But we also have a unique growing environment here in Australia. So most of our growing is dry land. We don't irrigate, and most of it is winter grown. So we have a small region in central Queensland, northern New South Wales, that is a summer cropping area, but the rest is all dry land. So it's minimal water usage, it's rainfall only. So we are also growing them in some of the marginal areas so that we can look at the stress effects on these pulses and the variation that we get genetically and environmentally, so that we know, I guess, where the highest protein might come from or the most consistent protein might come from. So, for example, it might be better for Andrew to process a more consistent protein grain that gives a consistent protein rather than one that varies in 10% protein, which can happen within a paddock. All right, so they're the kind of traits that we're looking at. So the protein and a protein variability, and as well as the protein functionality.
That's great, and I don't want to move on from yet, because the conversation we had recently was about your trip to Europe and the fact that actually the research you're doing, sometimes we talked about is Australia too late to this game? But actually with the research you're doing,
this is quite a unique project in that basically they haven't done this type of work in Europe, whereas they're really excited to see what we're doing and try and understand what we're doing so they can learn from us as much as anything. So they're quite established in this space, but essentially they're interested in using, so when you look at Germany, Germany's 55% flexitarian, but they want to source German-grown plant-based products, right? But it's a small growing region, whereas in Australia we have a large growing region. So what I hope to see is Australia really being a global food bowl because we have such a low population, or global protein bowl even. So
Love it.
Yeah. Sorry, couldn't help myself. So we have this phenomenal resource. We grow pulses. We grow grain very efficiently with little resource, really. Yep. We're really good at what we do, and we have large production numbers. We're comparable globally, and we export, and we're up there with the big boys, really.
And we're recognised globally for how high quality our products are, that there is demand for our grains, for ingredients offshore. So our grains are going elsewhere to be processed into ingredients. We should be definitely doing that more here.
Absolutely, we so should. Yeah. And the companies like Andrew's is absolutely ideal.
Oh, segue for me there.
Can I just, I think I'd follow on from that as an ingredient processor. I really can't stress enough how important this kind of work is. I think there's a lack of understanding from a food industry perspective how much of the reality of food production and unit costs, and I'm sure we'll get onto scale and some of the challenges in the plant.
We will,
I won't jump too far ahead. But all roads lead back to where the crop is grown in the first place. Food doesn't just magically end up on the plate. It comes back to how efficiently is the crop grown, what is the yield of the crop, how good is the crop to drought resistance, weed control, all the realities of what leads to the price of that product in the first place. All those things affect the price. If Cass's work can make a 2% increase or a 4% or a 5% to keep that, making those incremental improvements that we can then pass on to consumers and food companies, that will all go to making Australia a more competitive space, because we're competing in this ingredient space. We're competing against other countries. We're competing against France and Canada, and therefore it is super important that all of industry is working together to be able to create that efficient product.
Talking about competition, or where really the different markets where we could be competing with international ingredients, but instead it could be ours. What are those different markets? I mean, the export ones, yes, where are those great ones, but actually also into the categories specifically, because, you know, I put up a picture of a concentrate. You don't necessarily know where that goes, but it's actually into a lot more categories than perhaps we appreciate.
Yeah. So I think when we think about alternate protein, we're thinking really about the use of protein that is far broader than the sort of narrow field of alternate meat per se. So yes, we're certainly really interested in working on a number of opportunities in the extruded space, in the alternate meat space, but really we think much more broadly in terms of the number of opportunities right now in things like pulse-based snacking, so extruded snacks. There's been a real growth, if you go down the supermarket aisle, just the growth in that category of, just think chickpea chips, extruded snacking products. That category is really expanding, and there's more and more people thinking about having pulses in their diet. Export-wise, some of our more exciting opportunities are in markets like Japan and Korea in terms of fortifying noodle formulations with protein, bakery opportunities in Japan. Again, taking existing plant-based products and innovating those products to think about how we can improve the texture of them, the colour of them, not just improve the nutritional quality. So it's a really broad category in that sense.
And we'd be remiss if we didn't speak about the fact that in creating these protein ingredients, actually there's a lot of byproducts that are just as valuable. So we're talking about the starches and the fibres or flours as well. So what about those markets? Because obviously you've got to find value in the entire pulse if you're going to be processing it.
So that is a real work in progress. So the biggest challenge, to produce 1 tonne of protein, we are producing 3 tonnes of starch. So The protein industry is really, the protein generation industry is really the starch generation industry. And the avenues for protein are much greater than the avenues for starch. There is a lot of starch imported into Australia. Think tapioca starch, cornstarch, potato starch. Australia, there is a big opportunity for us to do a lot more research in terms of how we can use Australian-made, gluten-free, allergen-free starches in a broader range of applications. Same goes for fibre. Again, they're really tricky ingredients to further process, and a lot of those ingredients, again, are still coming from the Northern Hemisphere. So it's definitely an area for work from a research perspective and a commercial one.
Okay, great. Thank you. Arjan, back over to you. As we said, you are, Simplot is obviously in food manufacturing, but you then are selling those products direct to consumers through retail, but also into food service and QSRs and into aged care. For a company like Simplot, what are the drivers in having plant-based offerings? Is it about the nutrition, about the diet? Does Scope 3, for instance, come into it? Is it about being able to meet the consumer requirements, but also potentially some of the reporting ones?
Look, it's a great question, and it's a multifaceted answer, I think. Simplot, our mission is to contribute to feeding our world by sustainably bringing Earth's resources to life. So I mentioned at the start, we're vertically integrated. So we have farming operations, we have food manufacturing operations. In the US, we even go as far as having mining operations to get fertilizers and the like. So as a part of that play, we are looking at multiple angles. Sustainability plays a huge part in that. We've played a role in food waste and fight food waste. And, one of the key topics that was on the agenda this morning around reducing emissions. And Scope 3 and quantification of Scope 3, like a broader play in a part of the food industry. We are looking at that and understanding the role that we need to play in that. On our global scale, our plant-based business is still relatively small, but it's been very enthusiastically supported by our family, so we're a family-owned company, and they are the ones that have really pushed us to explore this as an opportunity. Australia is, I think, a test for us globally as to what this looks like, how does it work for us. And beyond that, it's also, I think, just a really clear space that we play in, where we're a large vegetable manufacturer here in Australia, both frozen and shelf-stable vegetables. So it was a natural space for us to play in to meet those emerging global consumer trends as well. So it's a number of those reasons all coming together in one.
And I think it was a good point there, and it's the same into the ingredients, not just downstream in the actual final food products as well, is that, I mean, Australia's a small market, so we do get to do that testing here, but Australia's opportunity for any of our food and beverage categories actually isn't just about servicing what is actually a very small consumer market. Our skill is in the export of high quality products, and this is one of them that can be part of it too. And were you about to add something to that?
I think it's a really valuable point as well, and with the larger Asian markets on our doorstep, it's a huge opportunity that we're not blind to either. It's how do we here in Australia really understand what the Asian markets are after as well, because it's I think what we took away from this morning is food is about nutrition, but food is also about taste, but more broadly food is cultural. We've talked a lot about the barriers that presents as well, so it's also the opportunity to understand how do we as Australian food manufacturers really understand those consumer environments, those different cultural environments of those countries, to be able to meet those consumer needs in those countries.
That's a great response. And touching on the barriers there, we've sort of spoken about this, but obviously what we're talking about here is onshore manufacturing, and we know manufacturing in Australia isn't a cheap endeavour, So let's talk about the elephant in this room, which is obviously the cost. We know it's cheaper in some regards to import soy, for instance, as an ingredient. So how can we make what we're offering cost competitive, because it's considerations across the entire supply chain, from the farmers who are deciding what crop is going into their rotation based on what's the value on the other side, what are they going to get in the market. Then it's also for the ingredient manufacturers, what's the cost to me of sourcing that particular crop. And then in the protein content versus the byproducts that come with it. Then it's also for the manufacturers, the cost of sourcing that ingredient. And then, of course, at the end of that is the consumer, the cost to them to actually buy a Australian-made product. So how do we address cost as this big issue? How are we going to bring down the cost? Or actually is Australia's opportunity in premium products? And that is a question to all of you, but Cass, at the beginning of representing the beginning of the supply chain,
I think it's
it's
all of the above. Like, I think we have the opportunity to create high-value products. We have niche market varieties that are specialty varieties that may have special components that are attractive for human nutrition, that are attractive in terms of low GI, that are high protein. And so there's unique opportunity to develop new products, niche, high value. Then there's also an opportunity to influence Australian consumers in that, like, we're only a 17%, as far as I'm aware, flexitarian society in Australia. We've got like so much scope to increase that to 55% like the Germans. Why not? Like, why not use that innovation? We're Australian proud, like that's who we are as a society. Why not be proud to use whole Australian ingredients in what we do in our cooking, and you know, and why not promote that, market that, and research that and innovate that? That's something that we do well as a society in Australia. We have a lot of innovation here.
And I jump in really quickly, because this question wasn't to me, but to what you were saying there, Cass, was, you know, even it actually doesn't always have to be about Australian diets either, because as Andrew, you spoke to, these ingredients, they're not just for us to eat. Therefore, we can be talking about this as an Australian and an animal feed and aquaculture opportunity. We don't need to import these ingredients if we could be making them here ourselves. Again, this is a question of cost and what's going to be the best value for it. But that's a part of the equation as well. Just like, turns out we use soy as an ingredient, a protein in shampoos and conditioners. We could be putting our own products into this as opposed to importing.
Yep. There's also dog food, isn't there?
There
like,
is.
there's a whole range.
But I think unit cost is just, I mean, the market is really challenging, right? So I think probably the lesson we've learned so far, it is not easy, right? So anyone who is in this industry, who is either in any element of the supply chain right now, is probably not thinking to themselves, boy, isn't this really simple? It is hard because we don't have the scale in Australia yet to really bring unit costs down to get the efficiencies of scale. So I think where we're seeing challenges in the market is just where companies have got to be really careful about where they're going to play, is just being really pragmatic about saying, okay, where do we have to be pragmatic that the industry is not in a position to manufacture something in Australia and just import the product? And there's examples of that, and soy, I think, is a really good example of that, in saying, let's just, the market needs to mature a long way before there's going to be enough scale in soy production or soy extrusion, as an example. In other elements of the supply chain, we just say, okay, what's the competitive advantage we're going to bring in Australia? So we say, okay, is there enough of the crop? And then each individual company's really got to ask themselves, what right do they have to win in that category? Do they have some kind of processing advantage or a supply chain advantage that can allow that product to be produced at a unit cost that it can at least make money while the scale in the market and the maturity in the market grows? Because I don't think there is any doubt whatsoever about where the market will get to. So I think there's a lot of, I'm super comfortable where the market's going to be in 2040. The question just is, how long does it take to build that real scale where we can compete against imported soy, for example? We're not anywhere close to that. That will take time. We will get there, but again, it's a slow road, and we've got to bring together a whole range of things like sensible allocation of capital, sensible breeding, increased work in terms of food formulation and innovation to find new uses for those ingredients. But again, there's an element of patience that needs to come as well.
That's a very good point. This is just a long-term view we have to take, right? And sorry, I want to hear from you in just a second, because it is about that long-term view, and that, yes, the market globally will be massive in 2040, but what will Australia's position in that be? Will we be leading? Will we just be importing?
I think we can lead in some, sorry, Aaron. We can lead, I think we'll be able to lead in certain crops and certain ingredients where Australia has a unique advantage. And we should not lead in crops where we have no advantage at all. So I think it's really just saying, okay, let's pick those right things that we can do. Australia has so many advantages in certain kinds of crops, whether it's faba beans, whether it's oats, whether it's lupins, whether it's canola. Certain crops where we say, yeah, we can nail those crops and leave others to other countries where they're more uniquely placed. I think it's just picking the right places to play.
And Arjan?
I'm going to echo a lot of what Andrew said. I think from an end product manufacturer point of view, scale is king, and it's a game of scale, and it's a game of small improvements. And across that whole value chain, right from where Cassandra's starting with breeding, getting those crops that are actually designed and fit for purpose rather than commodities. How do we get crops that are actually designed to give higher protein levels and higher functional protein levels for the products we're looking to make, so that companies like Andrew's can do that conversion at a lower cost, again, get those volumes up, get those efficiencies, those small gains, so again, allows us to be more competitive. I think we're competing, at least from an end product point of view, against the meat industry, which is, credit to them, is very, very well optimized. They're a well optimized, well-oiled machine, and they do a good job. And in that nascent industry of plant protein, we're not there yet. So it's around how do we foster an ecosystem across the whole value chain where, to Andrew's point, we focus on what we have an advantage in. And the wonder of capitalism is that's what capitalism is good at, really driving those opportunities and driving those businesses that are successful and do have a right to win, and make sure that we give them the support that they need to get there so that we can start to build that industry. So whatever it looks like in the future, Australia has its fair share of what that pie and that opportunity can look like.
I want to ask another question there as well, and it leads into the last question before. Everyone, remember that this is open to Q&A. So if you do have your questions and you haven't already put them in, I've seen a couple come through and I'm very excited to get to them, but please keep flooding them our way. Because one of the other cost considerations, of course, is when we don't necessarily know how to use these ingredients yet very well in Australia, the cost to existing food and beverage manufacturers in Australia, especially in this sort of a cost of living crisis when they have to bring down the cost of their products to the consumers, and the cost of figuring out how do we use these ingredients, what is it going to look like to pull them in, what's the gelling, what's the the foaming, or any of what they're actually looking for these ingredients to do. There is a big question there, or a big resource commitment that's required on the product development. That's expensive to do that, and not all companies have that ability or even that interest. We're not known necessarily for innovation in our food and beverage manufacturing industries broadly. So how are we building that? How are we going to deal with that cost? And do you think, and certainly I do, is this a place that government can play in? And that's the question to everyone as well, is what's government role in all of this?
Look, I don't know that I think that government has a specific role in helping application. From where I'm sitting, and obviously, we develop in more categories as well, is there's plant-based functional ingredients that perform certain functions that might displace, for example, dairy ingredients. And dairy is a great example. If you look back over the last, 40-odd years, whey protein was something that used to get flushed down the drain and thrown away. It's been valorized to something that's now a high-value commodity, high-value functional ingredients. And it's that process of creating that functionality or improved functionality at improved prices where I see a real opportunity, and taking those into categories that aren't specifically plant-based categories. Think ice cream, think a lot of these other formulated products where these ingredients can play a role. And again, I go back to my point on capital following good ideas. And I think there's companies that do that and do that well and really show that application in those specific spaces. So it's about really helping nurture that ecosystem so these businesses can get the investment they need to be able to do that and drive that for themselves.
That's a great response. What about you guys? What do you think? Cass, as in, I recognise you are in government and actually think you are already doing something that is a phenomenal piece that government can be doing, is in this R&D that industry wouldn't necessarily be doing itself, because you're taking that long-term view that other grain industries have already done. So pass to you about this or anything else?
I think government's role can be to help facilitate the collaboration between research organisations and industry. So again, Cass's program is a good example where GRDC, which is a government body which is funded by grain levies, has understood that it needs to create an environment to invest in pre-competitive work. We, as an industry participant, do not have the capital or the risk to be able to fund those projects by ourselves. That's just a great example. We would say, geez, we can't put that level of money at risk because it's going to take too long. We don't know what the outcomes are. Government can play a great role in saying, yes, clearly the government needs to identify alternate protein as a space to invest in, and provide an environment, whether that is direct funding for research projects, whether that's finally supporting a pulse protein CRC or something else that would allow for ongoing funding or collaboration, then that is what will provide the long-term benefits for industry.
From what I do, it's about listening to industry, and it's about taking on board and then, I guess, putting into action what their needs are so that we can deliver, whether it be varieties or processes or systems that support the grower all the way through to the processor and consumer. So that's my perspective.
No, I think that's a very valid one, is because, Andrew, I mean, you said it yourself, this industry, ingredients, and even further down the plant-based foods, it doesn't exist without the farmer, and it doesn't exist if farmers aren't brought along the journey and that value doesn't go back to them. I mean, they'll grow what is going to give them the best return. And if it's not for an onshore market, they'll do it for whatever is the offshore demand. So I think certainly where I think government, and I'd be really excited to see this from our governments, is not necessarily, it's not about always throwing cash at something. It's actually sometimes it's about the thought leadership. We do need to see governments say, like we've seen in Canada, say, we want to win this opportunity. We need to see governments come out to say, this is the piece that we see, that this is a great onshore manufacturing piece. We can value add to what we do already so well here, and as opposed to, like in a lot of our industries, sending something off for it to be manufactured or processed elsewhere and then imported back, we could be doing that here, and we could be doing it in partnership with our grain growers. So that's certainly a piece that I would love to see. And it doesn't even need to be about what is actually any particular one downstream use of these ingredients. It shouldn't be about plant-based foods or plant-based meats even specifically, because it is so much bigger than that. This is about a category across. And I think one of the more exciting parts of the conversations we've had, Andrew, is actually even the opportunity we're talking about where this can benefit livestock industries, in that if this could be a domestic animal feed or aquaculture opportunity, we're talking about these major industries actually being able to reduce their own supply emissions by sourcing locally. So I certainly think it's a big opportunity, and that government can play a big role in that.
The one thing I've heard recently too is they want to reduce the soy because of its allergen going into aquaculture and going into animal feedlots. So why not use Australian pulses?
Yes. I wonder why. I think that's a really, really good idea you've got there. I think we should do that. So number of questions come through. Thank you so much. Like I said, please keep sending them through, because we'd like to answer. There's a number in here already about costs, and I think we've probably answered that one. But I think the question is, there's one in here which is, given the progress that Canada has made, or we know China is big in this space, we know the US is on this and France is on it as well, and Andrew, you said quite specifically, Australia can't be competing on what they do, we need to be competing on what we do. What do you think is one of those, or our key distinguishers here that we could be, and this question to everyone, that could be the key definer that gets us globally?
Well, I mean, again, I think if we look at of the markets that are non-soy, if we take soy and wheat out for an example, the Northern Hemisphere ingredient focus is entirely pea-based or predominantly pea-based, yellow pea, effectively. And that's borne out by just the sheer scale of the pea crop in the Northern Hemisphere. Australia has a completely different mix of cropping. So faba beans, we have a great advantage in Australia. The Northern Hemisphere just does not focus on that particular crop. So it makes complete sense that we can lead the way in developing high quality faba bean products. Chickpea is another. We've got an enormous chickpea crop. Again, the complete inverse of the Northern Hemisphere that is not, other than a few companies, there's not a lot of focus on chickpeas. So I think we can just pick those crops where we think others are ignoring them, develop really good ingredients, really good research capability, and really good application of those ingredients. And over time, I think we're really confident that the Asian market in particular will see Australia as the home for those kind of places, that they'd say, oh boy, if we want an application of a chickpea protein or a faba bean protein, really Australia is the place to be, not speaking to Canada or France or Israel or some of these other markets.
That's a good one. And Cass, question there, as opposed to competing, where are the opportunities for partnership? What about between Australia and Canada? Do you think that there are research partnerships we could be looking to there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of learnings we can take from the US as well as Canada as well as Europe. Like, why not use them as the testing ground and us take on board? Like, we can take on board and use our Australian slant, but just learn from what they've done, look at how they manufacture, look at how they, go from grow to produce, to manufacture, to consume. So absolutely, yes. It's ideal.
I think one to add to that, I think that the challenge is always how do we avoid the not invented here syndrome as well. There is, opportunities to learn from others. There is wonderful technology, and how do we encourage some of those players from other parts of the world to also establish operations here? There's large companies, and especially if you start talking about isolate plants, you're starting to talk significant investments. You're talking, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of investment to put up a plant like that. So you need somebody who knows what they're doing as well. So it's how do we increase the actual ecosystem here in Australia to make use of some of these opportunities, rather than looking at it as purely an Australian problem to solve for Australia? How do we collaborate globally? And I think there, again, is an opportunity from a government point of view to understand what those opportunities are and how to make those sorts of opportunities attractive to some of these other large multinational companies.
I think...
Yeah, because you alluded to the size of the crop that we have here, the size of our population. As I said, we're going to end up, there's going to be tipping points where Europe and America aren't going to be able to produce for even their own, similar to India, for example, in the commodity-based market. The reason why we've got a commodity-based market in pulses is because there's not enough grown in India to feed the Indian population. There's going to be tipping points where high-value products are going to be sourced from countries like Australia.
Well, I think actually that's the point, is that some of them are. There's been announcements made. Obviously, we've got big multinational companies who are already here, but the focus is on the production and then the bulk exporting. But those companies seem offshore, the Cargills, the ADMs, the Rockets of the world, they're here, but they're not processing these ingredients or making these ingredients here. They're doing it elsewhere, because that's where I think, yes, the government signals have been sent that that's the industry we want to grow here, but it's also where we've got in Europe consumers who are already very much more, plant forward, same into the US or the North America market more broadly. But I mean, Louis Dreyfus company, they announced not too long ago their intention to really invest in pulse ingredient opportunities. And they mentioned Australian pulses as being a part of that. So they're here, they want to use our ingredients, but they're talking about processing them, I'm assuming from the media statement, not here. So that's, but how can we send those signals to get these sorts of companies here to help in that scale, but also to make sure that our Australian homegrown companies are actually enabled by the broader ecosystem to lead as well here. We've got a minute left, and I would just ask final thoughts from everyone. What would you say, an audience that is missing here that we all need to be working on, or what are the missing pieces that are critical next steps for Australia to actually send the signal to the world that this is a serious opportunity and we want to capture it?
I just more collaboration. So that, I mean, that's just no individual company, no individual research organisation can do it by themselves. So I think more conversations, more open-minded dialogue, I think is the only way for us to deal with the opportunity to market of the scale like Australia.
Yeah, I think I agree. I echo exactly what Andrew says. It's all about collaboration. I think we've all got a part to play in this, and essentially, yeah, all can partner, and it's about openness and having, more consensus within Australia.
I'll be boring and I'll probably echo that one slightly. I think a rising tide lifts all ships. And it's how do we make sure that as an industry, though, we're all lifting each other up. I think it was reflected on earlier, it's a huge opportunity, but it's currently still a very small market. So by trying to steal market share of each other, fighting against each other and trying to undermine each other, we're fighting for a slice of an decreasing pie if we're not careful. And I don't think that's in anyone's best interest because, at the end of it, you end up being king of nothing. And that's in no one's benefit.
I love that. Everyone, thank you so much for your time.